East End London in the late 1800s was looked on by many with disgust as crime and squalor dominated the area. In this time, prostitution was legal, as long as you didn't cause a public disturbance of any kind, with many brothels and cheap lodging houses providing sexual services. But in the year 1888, a new threat stalked the streets of London, hiding in the shadows and terrifying the residents of Whitechapel. He seemed like a phantom in the night, butchering and degrading his victims, and then simply vanishing into the London smog. His name was Jack the Ripper. Today we delve into the Canonical Five's stories, as well as other suspected Ripper deaths during this time. These ladies were slaughtered in the streets, but they had dreams, families, and many misfortunes which led them to become prostitutes and subsequently into the line of fire of this serial killer. Mary Ann Nichols was 45 years old at the time she died, and sadly going through a tough time. Her marriage had fallen apart as after giving birth to her 6th child, it seems her husband's eyes had started to wander towards younger women. Destroyed by his betrayal, Mary Ann took to drinking as a way to ease her pain. With no money to speak of, she worked in the workhouses and any other type of job that she could find before finally succumbing to her situation and sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square. With no hopes of getting out of her predicament, she did what many had to do back then and turned to prostitution. On August 31st at 2:30 a.m, she was witnessed drunk and staggering by her friend Emily Holland at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road, and sadly this was the last time she was seen alive. 2 carmen, Charles Cross and Robert Paul, were on their way to work at around 3:40 a.m. when they saw what they believed to be tarpaulin lying in front of a gated horse stable entrance on Bucks Row. But upon closer inspection, they discovered Mary Ann with her skirt pulled up around her waist. Now, unsure whether she was drunk or not, they touched her hands and face but discovered them to be cold. By now, they're feeling quite anxious and decided to track down the first constable they could find. Just minutes later, though, PC John Neal was doing his rounds passing through Bucks Row when he shone his lantern on her body, her eyes said to be staring up into the night sky. Her throat had been deeply cut in 2 places, causing her head to be nearly decapitated. Her lower abdomen was partially sliced open by what was described as a deep, jagged wound, while also cutting her in several other places around her abdomen. A doctor later announced that he believed she died only 30 minutes before the time she was discovered. Mary Ann was buried at the City of London Cemetery on 6th of September, paid for by her father, husband and eldest son. Annie Chapman, born Eliza Ann Smith and nicknamed Dark Annie, seems to have lived the first part of her life in reasonable comfort, having a home in Windsor near to the royal castle. Another indicator that she and her husband John Chapman had some financial security is the fact that there is a photograph of them both taken around 1869 in a time when working class people didn't have the luxury to have their photographs taken. Unfortunately, that was where her luck ended, as even though she was married with 3 children, her eldest daughter died from meningitis aged just 12, and her youngest, a son, was born disabled and added a lot of pressure to the couple. Sadly, before long, she became estranged from her family and by the 1880s had sought comfort in alcohol. Her husband tried to help as best he could, sending her money periodically until his death in 1886. By this time, she'd started to sell her own crocheted work as well as matches and flowers. But by 1888, now aged 47, she was described as being malnourished and suffering from chronic illnesses. Times were so tough that just days before her murder, she was seen brawling in the street with another woman called Eliza Cooper over a piece of soap. During this fight, Annie gained a black eye as well as bruises on her chest and head. She was described as being in great pain, and the fight highlighted the fact she was struggling to defend herself, growing weaker. On the evening before her murder, she even told a friend that she felt too ill to work, but knew she had to be able to afford a bed for the night. At around 5:30 a.m. on 8th of September, Albert Kadosh reported seeing Annie talking with a man outside 29 Hanbury Street. He lived on the same street at number 27 and said he heard a woman in a backyard moments later shouting "no," followed by what he believed to be someone falling against the fence. Just 20 minutes later, her body was discovered by John Davis near a doorway in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Just like Mary Ann, her throat had been savagely cut and her abdomen was torn completely open. Her intestines were still attached but placed over her right shoulder, and an autopsy revealed that Jack the Ripper had even removed her uterus and parts of her vagina. This was beyond killing. This seemed almost frenzied, if not for the fact that the killer seemed to have precision in the way he sliced. She was laid to rest on 14th of September at Manor Park Cemetery. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden on November 27, 1842, emigrating to England in 1866. When she married John Thomas Stride, life was going well, even opening a coffee shop together in Crisp Street, Poplar. But in 1877, the couple separated and life took a turn for the worse, where making ends meet was a daily struggle. She took up lodgings at 32 Flower and Dean Street, where she would clean for the landlord for extra money, as well as working the streets at night as a prostitute. On 29th of September, she had cleaned 2 rooms during the afternoon, earning 6pence, and was seen in the Queen's Head pub at 6:30 p.m, relaxing with a drink before heading out to work the dangerous streets of London. Just after midnight on September 30th, she had been seen trying to find shelter from the cold autumn weather, but sadly it seemed something dark and murderous found her before she could. At 12:45 a.m, a man called Israel Schwartz saw her being attacked by a man in a gateway off Burner Street, known as Dutfield's Yard. He decided not to intervene as he assumed it was a couple having a fight, so crossed the road to avoid them. It is very likely he witnessed Jack the Ripper and the beginning of Elizabeth's end. At approximately 1 a.m, just 15 minutes later, her body was discovered in Dutfield's Yard by Louis Dimeschutz, whose horse had tried to avoid something lying still in the street. After prodding the bundle with his whip and seeing no movement, he went to investigate and by matchlight discovered a woman lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been cut severely, severing her left artery, but nothing else had been done to her. Elizabeth was buried in the East London Cemetery on 6th of October. The citizens of London were now terrified after hearing about her death and formed a mob to do what they believed the police couldn't: find the killer, making Jack the Ripper a priority for Scotland Yard. But how she died left people to debate whether or not she was really a victim of the Ripper, as her death didn't carry the same markers. However, most experts believe that he was disturbed by Israel Schwartz while starting his ritualistic attack, and that is why no further mutilations took place. It might also explain why he killed another woman just 45 minutes later. Catherine Eddowes, known as Kate to her friends, was born in Wolverhampton on April 14, 1842, moving to London as a child. But when her parents died when she was mid-teens, the decision was made to split her and her siblings up and send her back to Wolverhampton to live with an aunt. Here, she met a man called Thomas Conway, who she was rumoured to marry, though no official documentation was ever found. With him, she had 3 children, even getting his initials tattooed in blue ink on her arm and moving back to London by the 1870s. But life was difficult, as the only money they made was from selling cheap magazines in the street, and Catherine's sister later said that Conway was abusive to her, as she was often seen with a black eye. By 1880, they had separated and Catherine took up residence at 55 Flower and Dean Street. In 1881, she met a man called John Kelly, who was a casual labourer, and she stayed with him until her death. On 29th of September 1888, Catherine had been having a rough night, as at 8:30 p.m. she was discovered drunk, lying in the street by PC Lewis Robinson. There was a crowd of people staring at her unconscious body when the PC tried to help her up. He tried propping her up against the shutters of a shop, only to have her fall down again, leading him to throw her in the cells for a while to sober up. At around 1 a.m. on September 30th, Catherine was released from the police station, turning left as she went out the doors, heading away from Whitechapel and just a short distance from police who were dealing with the body of Elizabeth that had just been discovered. At 1:35 a.m, Catherine was seen by 3 men talking with a man at the church passage entrance into Mitra Square. Just 10 minutes later, Police Constable Alfred Watkins discovered her body, and it seemed the killer had upped his brutality. It was believed she had been dead less than 30 minutes as her body was still warm, which holds true when you consider the eyewitnesses. Catherine's throat had been cut and her abdomen ripped open with another jagged wound, but this time, along with removing part of her uterus, he also removed her kidney. When officers arrived at this scene, it seemed that maybe Jack had been a little more careless as evidence was left behind. A piece of Catherine's apron had been sliced away and found in a doorway soaked in blood. Above the area was anti-Semitic graffiti which had not been seen earlier in the evening by the beat policeman. While talking to the witnesses further, a description of the man seen with Catherine was given. He was described as being around 30 years old, 5'7", medium build, fair complexion and moustache. They said that from his clothing, they figured he was a sailor. Could this description be Jack the Ripper? And why did he write the graffiti? Was he trying to mess with the police and throw blame? Also, why had he cut Catherine's apron? Was it meant as a trophy of his kill that he dropped in his haste as he made his escape? And if so, did he take other trophies from his previous killings that were never picked up on? Catherine was laid to rest at City of London Cemetery on October 8th. Considered the last official victim of Jack the Ripper, it is safe to say that Mary Jane Kelly's death was the most horrific. There is not very much known about Mary Jane's early life other than what was told to police by her ex-boyfriend Joseph Barnett. He claims that she was born in Limerick, Ireland, had 6 or 7 siblings, and her father's name was John Kelly. When she was still young, the family moved to Wales, where she found love at 16, marrying a man with the last name Davis or Davies. Sadly, happiness didn't last long as her husband was killed 3 years later in a mine explosion, leading Mary to move to Cardiff, and her life in prostitution began. From here, she moved to London in 1884 and began working in a high-class brothel in Knightsbridge. She told Barnett that she dressed well and had even journeyed to France a few times, but disliked the place, so moved back to London. But like we have already seen, luck didn't seem to follow these ladies, and before long, Mary Jane was struggling to make ends meet. Barnett lived with her for a while, but when money was tough to find, she would always turn back to prostitution, which led to their breakup. It seems he beat himself up about the whole situation, saying to a newspaper, "She would never have gone wrong again had we been able to work things out." On Friday, November 9th at 10:45 a.m, Thomas Boyer was sent to 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street to collect rent from Mary Jane, as at the time she was several weeks behind in paying. He knocked on the door a couple of times, but when there was no answer, reached his hand through a crack in the window, pushing aside a coat that was being used as a makeshift curtain. And it's safe to say the poor guy probably wished he'd just walked away instead. Her body was so badly mutilated that she was barely recognisable as a human being. Her abdominal cavity had been completely emptied out, her breasts had both been cut off, and her viscera placed underneath her head and on the bedside table. Mary Jane's face was cut away almost completely, as well as her heart being removed, which he took with him. Was this a trophy from this crime scene? While police were investigating this horrific scene, they did find a witness of sorts. A woman living upstairs called Elizabeth Prater heard a scream of pain at around 4 a.m, but decided to keep out of whatever was going on. Now you can only imagine how she felt in the morning when the body was discovered. Shocked? Guilty? Afraid? Mary Jane was given a Roman Catholic burial under the instruction of Joseph Barnett. But was Mary Ann Nichols the Ripper's first victim? And was Mary Jane his last? 2 deaths that happened before the canonical 5 were Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Trabram. On April 3rd, Emma was beaten and raped, and if that wasn't bad enough, the gang of 3 men, one who was thought to be a teenager, violently inserted a blunt object inside her, tearing her up. Like the trash they believed her to be, they left her alone to die in the street. This woman was extremely brave and managed to stay alive long enough to tell the police what had happened before slipping into a coma and dying the next day. The press seemed to link her death to the others due to the location of her murder, But Whitechapel at this time was notorious for gangs who would demand protection money from prostitutes. And if they didn't get what they wanted, what good was the poor woman to them? The next lady was called Martha Trabram, and many believe her to be the official first victim. In the evening of August 6th, Martha had been seen drinking with her friend Pearlie Poll along with 2 soldiers. Shortly before midnight, the ladies paired off with their customers, with Martha heading into George Yard on Wentworth Street. Now, her body was first discovered at 3:30 a.m. on August 7th by George Crow after returning from work. Due to the darkness of the stairwell, though, he believed it to be a drunk passed out on the landing. Then at 5 a.m, her body was found again by another resident of George Yard buildings, and due to the rising sun, her wounds could now be seen. She'd been stabbed 39 times around her throat, chest and lower abdomen by what appeared to be a small knife, like a penknife, with the exception of one stab wound to her chest, which seemed to have been done with a large dagger or bayonet. Like I said, many think that she was Jack's first victim due to how brutal the attack was, but experts think this is wrong as Martha was stabbed, not slashed, something the Ripper seemed to prefer. After the canonical 5, 3 more murders happened. Alice McKenzie was discovered on July 17, 1889. Her carotid artery was severed and there were small cuts and bruises all over her body too, which was deemed as evidence of a struggle. Many people believe that this might have been the work of a serial killer trying to copy the Ripper. The next Whitechapel murder victim was given the name the Pinchin Street Torso, found on September 10, 1889. The body was found headless and legless under the railway arch of Pinchin Street, but due to how she died and where it is, it's unlikely to be another victim of Jack. The last murder was a strange one, as on February 13, 1891, Frances Coles was discovered at Swallow Gardens with her throat cuts and visible wounds to the back of her head. Upon investigation, it's believed the head injuries occurred as she fell to the ground after the wound to the throat. Worth noting is there were no other mutilations done to her body. Now, I said that this one was strange, and that's because a man named James Thomas Sadler was arrested and charged with her murder, only to be released on March 3, 1891 for lack of evidence. The same man was believed by authorities to be Jack the Ripper. With so many different theories on who Jack the Ripper might have been, ranging from a prince, a butcher, a doctor and so on, and many people stating that they have found out who the culprit is. But truth is, we may never know for sure. Why did he stop killing after Mary Jane Kelly? Was he arrested for some other crime? Did he end up in a mental hospital or possibly die? There are also those that believed he lived overseas and was only in London for a short period of time, which is why he was never caught. Are there similar crimes in other countries about this time? Is this the sailor that was seen? What do you think? I would love to know your thoughts in the comments below. I honestly think it would be hard for a man who did the acts he did to just stop, as he seems he was driven to kill for whatever reason, and the murders were becoming more brutal, like he was spiralling out of control. When he was interrupted with Elizabeth Stride, the fear of capture didn't make him run away and hide, but seems he was filled with frustration that he had not killed in his ritualistic way and had to kill again, quickly. If I honestly had to guess what became of Jack the Ripper, I'd say he was admitted to an asylum by his family, as they knew he was not right in the head. Maybe even suspected him of the crimes and didn't want to be shamed by him and his deeds. There is also the possibility that someone from overseas is to blame, as there is the witness statement of a man dressed like a sailor seen with Catherine Eddowes just before her murder. Whatever the story, I can only hope that these ladies found the peace that they never received in life. I'm only sorry that their struggles ended the way that they did. Until next time, stay safe out there.